5G is poised to create disruption on many fronts, given its wired, fiber-like throughput and low latency. At a high level, the next generation cellular standard will accelerate broad digital transformation within the enterprise, as well as enable operators unique monetization opportunities on a global basis. 5G is also more inherently virtualized and software defined than prior Gs. Thus, it provides deployment flexibility in a number of scenarios. So can Open RAN and virtualized RAN deliver on the promise of agility in both CapEx and OpEx mitigation? Our discussion hopes to shed light on these topics and many more. So I'm pleased to have Derek Johnston on the call today. Derek has responsibility for marketing for the networks business unit at Samsung Electronics America. Welcome, Derek.
Hey, Will, how are you? Thanks for having me.
Doing great. Let's get started. And I kind of want to start with a sensational kind of, question before we kind of jump into the meat of the conversation. But what's your take on all of the drama tied, to the C-band deployment and the FAA and FCC?
I love it. Start with some controversy.
Yeah.
Seems so apropos. It was a big milestone moment for 5G in the US, right? Some great stories. And again, being in the industry and close to this topic, like we've been talking about 5G for so long and the promise of it. And so it was this big moment, and it was rather unfortunate because it was all muddied behind this narrative. And so it rallied around the situation, I think, as an industry, and went further than any other country in terms of design, deployment considerations, radio performance testing, all of that to ensure that all of the constituent concerns were addressed. But my personal view on it is that the regulatory concerns, the timing, how those risks were characterized in the public was largely not productive for anyone involved, for the industry, for the aviation industry, for the general public, and certainly not for the regulatory bodies. So I don't know. What are your thoughts on it? What was your?
I think it's a classic, scenario of two big governmental agencies just not coordinating very well. I mean, it was quite apparent that these concerns were raised well over a year and a half ago, and then push came to shove, and there were the last minute pleas to major operators, AT&T and Verizon in particular, because they had purchased so much C-band spectrum. And then I remember reading that Wall Street Journal, article it was interesting because it was a joint, letter written by AT&T and Verizon. But at the end of the day, I mean, clearly, I think it was a lack of communication. And what we're finding out is that, the altimeter effects were pretty mitigated, and these exclusionary zones that were set up around 50 major airports, I believe, in the United States, I think addressed a lot of that. But there are a lot of airports that are, sort of out in the hinterland, as well. And so certainly in my hometown of Austin, Texas, the airport is pretty set far out from downtown. So not really a dramatic effect in my opinion, but it's been interesting to follow. But let's get into the meat of the conversation. And I know Samsung is very focused on vRAN, and there have been a lot of infrastructure providers that are sort of claiming first to market. And I'd love you to, provide some examples of where really Samsung has been first to market.
Sure. Yeah, I think. Thanks for the question. So, Samsung. I think first of all, we continue to kind of stay at the forefront of virtualized RAN, and I think we've demonstrated leadership in the space commercially. But I think what really differentiates us, from other vRAN vendors, and that includes, it's a broad space, right? There's a lot of folks that have been after it for a while, some smaller firms, et cetera, but you also have the, big telco, technology developers. But what distinguishes us from the field is that we've been able to first fully virtualize the RAN to the extent that you can, which means that our commercial vRAN solution takes splits the baseband functions into a fully disaggregated virtualized distributed units or VDU and a virtualized central unit. So it takes all those functions that you can put into a software and then throw onto a COTS server and does that completely. And so, and that solution is in commercial networks today. And we've been doing that since 2020 when we started the collaboration with Verizon on their network. And so that vRAN collaboration has more recently, as we were just discussing, also included milestones like supporting the C-band launch or their C-band launch, which, interestingly enough, uses massive MIMO radio technology, which, massive MIMO radio technology, as you all know, is incredibly difficult to begin with in terms of the, digital signal processing and the RF processing that's involved to do in a traditional hardware sense. And people were always like, oh, you can't do massive MIMO on virtualized RAN. Well, our 64T, 64R commercial solution is delivering 5G C-band service on that commercial network today to millions of subscribers, and it's performing at the level of a hardware-centric solution or other solutions. And so, I think the proof is in the pudding. There have been other claims out there that first that were proof of concepts and things like that from others in the industry, but our commercial vRAN solutions out there and it's delivering. And that's just one of them. We've made progress in Asia and in Europe as well. So just I want to say it was maybe even just yesterday. The days are running together. We did with KDDI, big technology forward vendor in Japan or service provider in Japan. So they're doing their 5G. So this was an industry first too. It's the first 5G standalone vRAN, network with an Open RAN compliant site. So it's again the beginning of their 5G standalone journey, if you will. But it's in a ORAN vRAN setup. We're also working with NTT Docomo, which in Japan and doing Open RAN compliant solutions for their 5G setup. And then in Europe, I think again, the proof point there is that we recently did the first ORAN site with Vodafone in the UK, which is part of their big kind of 5G journey, if you will. And so that site was lit up, and it's one of many that will follow. And then we've got ongoing collaborations with Orange with their ORAN lab that was recently initiated, I want to say last year, as well as discussions with other operators like Virgin Media O2 and stuff like that. So the opportunities are growing in that, in that particular region for us.
I'm glad you touched on the performance piece, because I think often naysayers talk about these solutions being more cost optimized versus performance optimized. And that's a great segue to my next question for you. I know that Samsung has been an early proponent of ORAN, Open RAN, relative to sort of your traditional incumbent, competitors. But often I think ORAN and vRAN get interchanged. And so would love it if you could spend some time and kind of delineate the difference between the two.
Sure. Yeah, no, that's a great point. It is funny because I think even with our, the folks that we follow kind of in the industry and the trades and stuff like that, it's always, there seems to be always a kind of a mashup of the terminology. And so I feel like there's always a need to unpack that. The best way that I've heard it characterized or explained to me is that, virtualized RAN is, taking all elements of the radio access network that can be driven by software and making those functions virtualized, and then being able to put those things on a COTS server, right?
Yeah.
And so vRAN is really, it's that migration, it's virtualization, it's what we did with the core back in, I don't know, it was 2015 or something like that, when it all went kind of more software-based functions. And so it's both a technology choice, but it's also an architectural choice in terms of how you approach your network. Open RAN, on the other hand, is really the industry effort to develop standards for RAN, open standards for RAN interfaces to allow, interoperability between the vendor's equipment. And so
Yeah.
Open RAN can use virtualized RAN approaches, given the flexibility that the software approach allows for it. But that said, the open interfaces being driven by the ORAN Alliance and TIP don't necessarily require a vRAN approach.
Right. No, it makes perfect sense, and that's a pretty simplistic explanation of the differences. I appreciate that. One final question for you, and I want to go back to ORAN. I mean, obviously, it's very compelling. The capex and opex, benefits of deploying Open RAN. Lots of proof of concepts are going on. You sort of spoke to some of the activities that Samsung is engaged in, but this is bringing in a new sort of ecosystem of partners, right? And so one of the challenges is with disaggregation, you have complexity, and it requires an integration. And so I'm wondering, what is Samsung thinking about with respect to the integration of Open RAN from an operator perspective?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, Will. I think it's classic because it's one of those areas where when you have an industry that has for so long had approached the kind of the network in one way, and all of a sudden there's different ways of doing things. There's always a lot of discussion and FUD that gets thrown around, in terms of the new approaches. So, Open RAN's like, it's kind of like doing the classic analogy is like doing something that's never been done before. So, it's not going to be without its risks and its challenges. So,
yeah.
I think we've seen a lot of that. I think with Open RAN, the thing that I think we have seen that is helpful in terms of the integration discussion, and that kind of what's the upfront challenges and some of the focus that got put on some of the larger or the first really large scale announced network with Rakuten was I think what we've seen is if the operator has taken an approach and strategically has this kind of mindset to go down the Open RAN approaches, there's processes and organizational shifts and changes that need to take place, I think, first and foremost at the operator level, right? Because at the heart of it, networks, are a collaboration between the technology provider and the actual service provider themselves. So part of that journey is that, and having that kind of set up, and the folks and the right folks in it going to that software or interface, and how do I manage a service rollout or a software update, and I can test, validate it, et cetera, and I'm doing it in more of a different process than I would in a hardware centric manner. So I think that's one thing. Yeah. The other piece is that I think we have, at least in our ORAN, deployments to date, either offered or served as the prime integrator, and I think one of the advantages that we bring to the table when you look at kind of ORAN vRAN is you have some of the smaller players out there that don't necessarily have long lineage or the full kind of stack, if you will, in terms of whether it's both in the RAN development perspective, but also we've got a perspective that goes from chipsets to devices all the way through the network. So there's a lot of things that I think we have competencies in, that we understand in deploying and designing the network. But that notion of going down and having kind of one throat to choke in the system integration process is fairly key in these early days. And that's the other thing. It's I think for us, it's been taking a mindset of is early days with ORAN. You have to have a very deliberate and methodical approach to it, and go with I think a vendor choice in the RAN space that understands a lot of the complexities and has the processes, the personnel, et cetera, that have done that and can manage through it. And I think honestly, like the discussion of delays and costs and things like that, and early upfront costs and stuff like that, I think is a lot of noise because it's new, and it does, things are going to take time to develop and to run their course. I think that's the other, perspective we bring to the table.
Yeah.
So.
No, it's all super compelling. I personally have been impressed to see Samsung's growth outside of the core Asian market over the last few years. I mean, your work with Verizon has been quite impressive, and you've really grown over the years. And so I'm also looking very forward to spending time with Samsung at Mobile World Congress as well. But Derek, thanks for the insightful conversation.
For sure. Yeah, absolutely. Well, yeah, it's been an absolute pleasure. Good to see you again.
Good to see you too.